The salt spray, sharp and icy, stung Sergeant Jack Riley's cheeks, a stark contrast to the humid, cloying air that had clung to him for weeks. November 8th, 1942, a date etched into his memory with the ferocity of a bayonet. He hunched deeper into his trench coat, the rough wool scratching against his jaw, and scanned the inky blackness of the Atlantic. The sea was a restless beast tonight, its waves crashing against the hull of the USS Wakefield, a troop transport groaning under the weight of its human cargo. Below deck, 1,000 men, their hearts a chaotic symphony of fear and anticipation, waited. Jack wasn't waiting. He was enduring. Enduring the gnawing emptiness in his gut, the phantom ache of a sister's face he'd promised to protect, the ever-present thrum of dread that whispered of the unknown. They called it Operation Torch. A bold gamble, they said. A torch lit in the darkness of North Africa, meant to drive back the Axis tide. But as Jack watched the distant, flickering lights of the Moroccan coast, a mirage of safety in the vast, indifferent ocean, he felt no fire, only a chilling premonition. "Cold enough for you, Sergeant?" A voice, gruff and laced with a familiar weariness, cut through the wind. Lieutenant Thomas Ashton, his face a study in shadows and fatigue, materialized beside him. Ashton was a man forged in the crucible of war, his eyes holding a depth of experience that Jack both admired and feared. "Just about perfect, Lieutenant," Jack replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He knew Ashton saw through his bravado. They all did. They were a band of brothers, bound by shared hardship and the grim understanding that tomorrow they might be brothers no more. Ashton grunted, his gaze fixed on the same distant shore. "They say it's going to be a walk in the park. Vichy French, not even Krauts." He spat the word kraut out like a bitter pill. "Never believe that for a second. No war is a walk in the park, Riley. Not for men like us." Jack nodded, his gaze drifting to the silhouette of the destroyer escorting them, its guns a silent promise of violence. "Still, it's better than a frontal assault on Fortress Europe, right?" He tried to inject a note of optimism into his voice, a desperate attempt to ward off the creeping despair. "Maybe," Ashton conceded, his voice a low rumble. "But the enemy isn't always the one with the swastika on his helmet. Sometimes it's the one you can't see, the one that festers in your own ranks." Jack's breath hitched. He knew what Ashton was hinting at. The whispers. The rumors that had been circulating among the troops for weeks, insidious and persistent. Talk of sabotage, of betrayal, of a hidden enemy within their own ranks. It was the kind of fear that gnawed at the edges of sanity, a phantom limb of anxiety that pulsed with every creak of the ship, every distant rumble of the engines. "You think?" Jack began, his voice barely audible above the wind. Ashton's gaze met his, sharp and unwavering. "I think we need to keep our eyes open, Riley. Wider than they've ever been. Because if those rumors are true, the real fight for North Africa begins before we even set foot on solid ground." The ship lurched, a sudden, violent shudder that sent a ripple of unease through the men huddled on deck. A distant alarm began to wail, a mournful cry that echoed the turmoil in Jack's heart. The landing was imminent. The torch was about to be lit. But as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, a bruised purple bleeding into a sickly gray, Jack Riley knew that the greatest enemy they faced on this fateful November morning wasn't waiting for them on the beaches of North Africa. It was already on board. The air on the Wakefield was thick with a peculiar blend of diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. Every man, from the rawest recruit to the seasoned sergeants, felt it. It was a palpable thing, a weight pressing down on their chests, making each breath a conscious effort. Jack, perched on the cold, wet deck, watched the dark bulk of the African continent loom larger, a promise of sand, sun, and, he hoped, victory. But the victory felt fragile. The whispers had started subtly, like static on a radio transmission, a missing shipment of ammunition, a coded message intercepted, but its meaning obscured. Then, a sabotaged engine on a landing craft, discovered just hours before it was to be loaded onto the transport. These incidents, isolated at first, began to weave a tapestry of unease. Each one, a tiny tear in the fabric of their confidence. "They're saying it's the Gremlins," whispered Private Miller, a lanky kid from Ohio whose eyes were perpetually wide with a kind of bewildered innocence. He clutched his rifle like a lifeline. "You know, those little guys who mess with planes and ships." Jack gave a grim smile. "Gremlins don't usually plant bombs, Miller, and they don't usually leave cryptic notes." He remembered finding one such note, tucked into a locker, scrawled in a hasty, almost manic hand. "The lion sleeps, but the serpent waits." It had sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the Atlantic breeze. Lieutenant Ashton, his face etched with exhaustion but his mind sharp as a honed blade, had been the first to voice the unspoken fear. "This isn't just bad luck, Riley," he'd said, his voice low and urgent, during one of their clandestine meetings in the cramped, steel confines of the ship. "Someone is actively trying to stop us, someone who knows our plans, our movements." The implications were terrifying. They were thousands of miles from home, in enemy territory, about to launch an offensive that would determine the fate of the war in this theater. To have a saboteur, a traitor, among them was a betrayal of the deepest kind. It was a serpent coiled in their midst, ready to strike at the most vulnerable moment. The tension on the deck was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. The men cast furtive glances at each other, suspicion blooming in the fertile ground of uncertainty. Was it the quiet corporal from Ohio who always seemed lost in thought? The gruff sergeant from Brooklyn who'd been unusually withdrawn? Every face was a potential mask, every smile a possible deception. "Get ready, men!" The booming voice of Captain Sterling, their commanding officer, cut through the murmuring. "This is it! Operation Torch! For God and country!" A ripple of nervous energy went through the ranks. Men checked their rifles, adjusted their helmets, and offered strained reassurances to their comrades. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a familiar sensation that war had etched into his very being. But this knot was different. It was laced with a new, insidious fear, the fear of an enemy within. As the first landing craft, a squat utilitarian vessel, began its descent towards the choppy water, a sudden, violent explosion ripped through the night. It came from the rear of the Wakefield, a deafening roar followed by a gout of fire and smoke. Panic erupted. Men screamed, some diving for cover, others scrambling to their feet, their faces contorted with shock and terror. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The serpent had struck. And the battle for North Africa had just begun. Not on the shores of Africa, but on the decks of their own ship. The greatest enemy wasn't the Vichy French or the Germans. It was the phantom in their midst, the traitor who planned to drench the sands of Africa, not with the blood of their enemies, but with the blood of their own. The fight for survival had just taken on a terrifying new dimension. The chaos that followed the explosion was a maelstrom of noise and confusion. The alarm bells, which had been a pre-landing drill, now shrieked with genuine urgency. Shouts of "man overboard" and "fire" mingled with the guttural roar of the explosion. Jack, his initial shock giving way to a surge of adrenaline, grabbed Miller by the arm. "Stay down, kid! Get your head down!" he yelled, pulling the younger soldier closer to the deck. The metal beneath them vibrated with the force of the blast, and the stench of burning oil and something acrid, like cordite, filled the air. Captain Sterling's voice, strained but clear, boomed over the din. "Damage report! We need a damage report, and find out what caused that." The explosion had ripped through the aft section of the ship, igniting a fire that licked greedily at the metal hull. Smoke billowed upwards, obscuring the pre-dawn sky and adding to the already suffocating atmosphere. Jack saw men scrambling, some with fire extinguishers, others with buckets of water, a desperate, futile effort against the inferno. Lieutenant Ashton was already moving, his face grim, his eyes scanning the scene with a terrifying intensity. He was barking orders, directing men, his movements precise and economical despite the pandemonium. Jack knew Ashton wouldn't be satisfied with a simple explanation of a freak accident. He was looking for the why. "Sergeant Riley!" Ashton's sharp voice cut through the noise. He was pointing towards a section of the deck near where the explosion had occurred. "Did you see anyone near there before the blast? Anyone acting suspicious?" Jack forced himself to think, to push past the roaring in his ears and the pounding in his chest. He'd been towards the bow of the ship, observing the landing craft, but he'd seen flashes of movement, shadows. He'd dismissed them as nervous soldiers or the shifting of cargo. "There were some men moving around back there," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't pay it much mind. Thought it was just pre-landing jitters." Ashton's jaw tightened. "Jitters don't usually involve plastic explosives, Riley." He gestured towards a section of the deck where debris was scattered. "Look, that wasn't accidental. That was deliberate." Jack's gaze followed Ashton's. Amidst the twisted metal and splintered wood, he saw it. A small, dark object, partially buried in the wreckage. It was a detonator, and next to it, a hastily discarded piece of paper. "Get that to me, Riley," Ashton ordered, his voice low and urgent. Carefully. Jack, his hands trembling slightly, carefully retrieved the detonator and the paper. The paper was damp, smudged with soot, but the writing was still legible, the same cryptic message he'd seen before. "The lion sleeps, but the serpent waits." "This is it, isn't it?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "The serpent." Ashton nodded, his eyes dark with grim certainty. "And it's coiled right here, on this ship. Our enemy isn't on the beaches, Riley. It's in our midst." The landing operations were in disarray. The explosion had caused a ripple effect of fear and confusion. Some landing craft, spooked by the blast and the ensuing chaos, had veered off course. Others were being held back, their crews struggling to maintain order. The carefully orchestrated ballet of invasion had devolved into a chaotic scramble. "We can't let this stop us," Ashton said, his voice ringing with a new, desperate resolve. "We have to secure this ship, and we have to find who did this, before we land, before they can do more damage." Jack looked around at the panicked faces of his fellow soldiers, the smoke still curling from the damaged section of the ship. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, a cold dread that seeped into his bones. They had trained for the enemy on the other side of the ocean, for the roar of artillery and the crack of rifles. They had not trained for this. For the quiet, insidious enemy who wore their uniform, who shared their rations, who plotted their destruction from within. "Who could it be, Lieutenant?" Jack asked, the question hanging heavy in the smoke-filled air. The faces of his comrades, once familiar and reassuring, now seemed alien, each one a potential suspect. The salt spray had been cold, but this was a chill that went deeper. A chilling realization that the greatest battle of Operation Torch would not be fought against the Axis powers, but against the darkness that had taken root within the heart of their own force. The torch, meant to illuminate the path to victory, was now flickering precariously, threatening to be extinguished by the very hands that were meant to hold it aloft. The acrid stench of burning oil and something acrid, like cordite, clawed at Jack's throat. He coughed, the sound rough and choked in the sudden, terrifying stillness that followed the deafening roar. Around him, the ship was a wounded beast, groaning and shuddering. Shouts echoed, a chaotic symphony of pain and confusion. But beneath it, a new sound began to creep in, a chilling, insidious whisper of fear. Not the fear of the Krauts waiting ashore, not the fear of the choppy Atlantic, but something far colder, far closer. Ashton's hand, still gripping Jack's arm, was a vice. His face, usually a mask of weary stoicism, was etched with a grim understanding that chilled Jack to the bone. "See, Riley?" Ashton's voice was low, strained, cutting through the din like a shard of ice. "I told you, the lion sleeps. But the serpent is already in the nest." Jack's gaze flickered from Ashton's face to the blackened, twisted metal of what had been a section of the deck just moments before. Twisted, like his own gut. The detonator, clutched tight in Ashton's other hand, felt impossibly heavy. A tangible piece of the nightmare they were living. And the note. He could see it. A stark white rectangle against Ashton's grimy palm. Another one. The same chilling message. The lion sleeps, but the serpent waits. Panic. A hot, sticky wave threatened to engulf them. Sailors scrambled, some dousing flames with hoses, others tending to the injured. The ship's alarm klaxons wailed, a mournful dirge that seemed to mock their desperate efforts. But Jack, fueled by a cold fury that burned hotter than the flames licking at the deck, focused on Ashton. "Who, Lieutenant?" Jack's voice was a raw rasp. "Who would do this? Now?" Ashton's eyes, usually sharp and piercing, were clouded with a profound, unsettling weariness. He scanned the chaos unfolding around them, his gaze lingering on the faces of the men, some heroic in their response, others frozen in terror. "That, Sergeant," Ashton said, his voice barely audible above the clamor, "is the million-dollar question. And right now, it's a question that could get us all killed." He gestured with his head towards a group of sailors, struggling to contain a spreading fire near a stack of ammunition crates. "Look at them, Jack. Every man out here is a potential victim. But one of them is the architect of this inferno, the one who lit the fuse." Jack's mind reeled. He'd served with these men. He'd shared rations, endured drills, and sweated through countless hours of training with them. They were supposed to be brothers in arms, forged in the crucible of war. The idea that one of them could harbor such malice, such a capacity for destruction, felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. "It has to be someone with access," Jack mused aloud, his thoughts racing. "Someone who knew the ship, knew the layout, knew the timing." Ashton nodded, a grim affirmation. "Precisely. Not some random Kraut sympathizer who snuck aboard. This is calculated. This is personal." He looked down at the note again, his brow furrowed. "The lion sleeps. That's Vichy France, the colonial power. But the serpent waits. Someone who sees themselves as the true power, the one who will strike when the time is right. Or perhaps someone who wants to ensure the lion doesn't wake up. Someone who wants to disrupt this whole damn operation." The implications settled over Jack like a shroud. Their mission, Operation Torch, was already a monumental undertaking, fraught with peril. Now this. A gaping hole in their readiness, a cloud of suspicion hanging over every single soul on board. Who could they trust? Who was watching their backs? And who was waiting to stab them in it? "We need to secure that detonator," Jack said, his gaze hardening. "And this note. We can't let anyone else see them, not yet." Ashton, with surprising alacrity, tucked the detonator and the note into a secure inner pocket of his uniform. Agreed. The fewer people who know about this, the better. Especially if our serpent is still prowling these decks. They moved, not as a cohesive unit, but as two islands in a sea of chaos, drawn together by a shared, terrifying certainty. The explosion had ripped a hole not just in the ship, but in their perception of reality. The enemy wasn't just on the beaches of North Africa. He was breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same cramped berths, possibly even standing shoulder to shoulder with them as they fought the flames. A wave of heat washed over them as they neared a section where the fire raged fiercest. Firefighters, faces grim and sweat-streaked, battled the blaze with grim determination. The air was thick with smoke, making breathing a conscious effort. Jack felt a gnawing emptiness in his gut, a primal fear that had nothing to do with the heat or the smoke. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of the unseen enemy who moved among them like a phantom. Lieutenant Miller, his face smudged with soot and his eyes wide with a childlike terror, stumbled past them, muttering about gremlins. He'd been one of the younger recruits, barely out of training, and the sheer violence of the explosion had clearly shattered his composure. "Gremlins, Miller." Ashton's voice was sharp, a stark contrast to the boy's terrified babbling. "There are no gremlins, Private. There are men, and one of them just tried to sink this ship." Miller flinched, then shook his head vehemently. "No, sir, it wasn't a man, it was everywhere, like a bad dream." He clutched at his head, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jack watched him go, a flicker of pity warring with his grim resolve. Miller's fear was understandable, a desperate attempt to rationalize the unimaginable. But Jack knew, with a certainty that was both horrifying and galvanizing, that Ashton was right. This wasn't the work of some mischievous spirit. This was deliberate. This was murder. Captain Sterling's voice boomed over the ship's loudspeaker system, cutting through the cacophony. It was strained, but firm, an attempt to impose order on the unfolding pandemonium. "All hands to your stations. Damage control teams, report. We have sustained an explosion, cause unknown. Maintain discipline. We are proceeding with Operation Torch." Jack and Ashton exchanged a look. "'Cause unknown," Ashton murmured, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "He has no idea, does he?" "We do," Jack replied, his voice low and steady. "And we have to make sure he knows before this serpent strikes again." The immediate aftermath of the explosion was a blur of frantic activity. Jack found himself pitching in with the damage control, his muscles aching, his lungs burning, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He worked alongside men he'd known for months, even years, their faces etched with the same grim determination he felt. But every now and then, his gaze would drift, scanning their faces, searching for any flicker of something out of place. A too calm demeanor, a too knowing glance. The paranoia was a constant, insidious hum beneath the surface of his actions. They managed to get the fires under control, though the damage was significant. Several sections of the ship were rendered unusable, and the smoke still hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the near catastrophe. The casualty reports began to trickle in, grim numbers that underscored the lethality of the attack. Thankfully, none of the casualties were from the primary landing parties, but the disruption was undeniable. The carefully orchestrated schedule of Operation Torch was in tatters. Later, as the ship began to slow and the first hazy outlines of the Moroccan coast appeared on the horizon, Jack and Ashton found a relatively quiet corner on the deck, the salty spray a welcome, albeit cold, caress against their grimy faces. The sea, still a restless beast, seemed to mirror the turmoil within them. "We need a plan, Lieutenant," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "We can't just wait for the serpent to strike again. We need to identify him." Ashton nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant shore. "And how do we do that, Sergeant? Without concrete evidence? without raising a panic that could cripple us even further? We have a note that could be dismissed as a prank, a detonator that could have been anything. But we know, Jack insisted. We know it's not a prank. We know it's sabotage. We saw the damage. He paused, his mind sifting through the events of the past few hours. Miller. He said gremlins. He was terrified, but he also seemed disoriented, like he saw something he couldn't comprehend. Miller is a scared kid, Ashton said, though his tone was thoughtful. He's not the serpent. The serpent is intelligent, calculated. He's playing a dangerous game, and he's using our own fears against us. But what if he's not alone? Jack countered, the thought taking root. What if Miller saw something, heard something, that the serpent didn't want him to? What if the serpent has a way of making people forget or doubt what they saw? Ashton was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowed in thought. You're suggesting a form of manipulation? Hypnosis? Drugs? I don't know, Lieutenant, Jack admitted. But the note, it's designed to sow discord, to make us question each other. And the explosion, it's meant to create chaos, to cover their tracks. The serpent is clever. He's not just a saboteur, he's a psychological warrior. And we are his targets, Ashton finished, his voice grim. He turned to Jack, his gaze sharp and direct. So, what do you propose, Sergeant? We can't possibly interview every man on this ship, not without official sanction, and Sterling is clearly determined to push forward. He can't afford to admit this level of internal rot before we even hit the beach. Jack took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He thought of the faces of the men he'd fought beside, the camaraderie, the shared sacrifices. And he thought of the chilling possibility that one of them was a viper in their midst. We start with observation, Lieutenant. We watch, we listen, we look for anything out of the ordinary. Any man who seems too calm in the face of this. Any man who seems to be enjoying the chaos. He hesitated, then added, and we try to piece together who had the opportunity to plant that detonator and that note. It has to be someone. Ashton met his gaze, a flicker of reluctant respect in his eyes. A dangerous game, Jack. A very dangerous game. But I suppose it's the only one we have left to play. He clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that felt more meaningful than ever. Let's just hope we find the serpent before he sheds his skin and disappears into the sands of North Africa. Because if he's still on this ship when we land, he'll be a far greater threat than any Vichy soldier. The ship continued its steady, albeit somewhat damaged progress towards the shore. The sun, a pale disk in the overcast sky, offered little warmth. The air, once filled with the nervous anticipation of invasion, was now heavy with a new, more insidious dread. The enemy was within, and the fight for North Africa, Jack realized with a sinking heart, had already begun. The real war, the one fought in the shadows of suspicion and betrayal, was about to commence. The salt spray, sharp and icy, stung Jack Riley's face, a familiar discomfort that usually grounded him. But today it did little to cut through the thick, cloying air of dread that had settled over the USS Wakefield like a shroud. The explosion, a violent, gut-wrenching roar that had ripped through the pre-dawn stillness, had transformed the ship from a vessel of anticipation into a tinderbox of fear. The distant, flickering lights of the Moroccan coast, once a beacon of hope, now seemed to offer only a more immediate, more terrifying stage for the unfolding drama. He stood on the pitching deck, the rough wool of his uniform scratching against his jaw, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The chaos of the explosion had subsided, replaced by a frantic, almost desperate efficiency. Damage control teams, their faces smudged with grease and sweat, moved with a grim purpose. their shouts swallowed by the wind and the ceaseless groan of the ship. But Jack's attention wasn't on the physical wounds inflicted upon the Wakefield. It was on the invisible ones, the insidious rot that had taken root within. The lion sleeps, but the serpent waits. The words, scrawled on that damning note, echoed in his mind, a venomous whisper that twisted his gut into a tighter knot. Captain Sterling, his face a study in shadows and fatigue, had dismissed the explosion as an unfortunate accident, a rogue wave, perhaps, or faulty ordnance. He'd barked orders, his voice strained but resolute, determined to push forward, to maintain the illusion of control. But Jack, standing beside Lieutenant Ashton, had seen the flicker of doubt in the captain's eyes, a fleeting shadow that mirrored their own gnawing unease. Ashton, his jaw set, his gaze sharp and unnervingly steady, had clasped Jack's shoulder. He has to believe that, Riley, for morale. But we know better. His voice, usually calm and measured, held a new edge, a steely resolve forged in the crucible of war and now tempered by the chilling reality of betrayal. Now, as the first sliver of dawn bled across the bruised sky, painting the turbulent Atlantic in hues of gray and sickly yellow, Ashton stood beside Jack, his silhouette stark against the burgeoning light. "We've got a ghost on board, Riley," Ashton said, his voice low, barely audible above the wind. "A saboteur, and he's not done yet." Jack nodded, the words feeling inadequate, a pale reflection of the chilling truth. The landing craft incident, the cryptic notes, and now this deliberate act of destruction. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a campaign. And their enemy wasn't the Krauts on the shore. It was someone standing right beside them, breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same rationed water. "Miller's still talking about gremlins," Jack said, a wry twist to his lips. He remembered the young private, his eyes wide with a child's terror, babbling about unseen forces that played tricks on machinery. "He's scared, Lieutenant." Ashton's gaze softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "We're all scared, Riley. But fear can be a weapon, and this serpent, whoever he is using it to paralyze us." He gestured towards the ship's interior, where the sounds of frantic activity still echoed. "Sterling wants to proceed. He's ordering the first wave to prepare for launch. We've lost time, and with it, the element of surprise. The Vichy French will be on high alert now, expecting us. And if the serpent strikes again before we even hit the beach?" Jack's voice was a low growl, the phantom limb of anxiety throbbing in his chest. "That's our problem, isn't it?" Ashton turned to face him fully, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, locking onto Jack's. "We can't let him. We have to identify him, and we have to do it now, before he can do any more damage." The weight of that responsibility settled on Jack's shoulders, heavy and suffocating. He was a sergeant, trained to follow orders, to lead his men into the fray. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a spy. But he was here. And Ashton was here. And the fate of their mission, perhaps even the lives of thousands, rested on their ability to unravel this knot of treachery. "How do we even start, sir?" Jack asked, the question laced with a genuine plea for guidance. "There are hundreds of men on this ship. Officers, enlisted, deckhands, engineers. Observation, Riley, pure and simple. We watch, we listen. We look for the cracks. The man who seems too calm, the man who's always in the right place at the wrong time, the man who doesn't quite fit." Ashton's gaze swept across the deck, his mind already piecing together a strategy from the shards of chaos. "And we start with the evidential trail. The detonator. The note. Who had access? Who had the technical knowledge?" Jack thought back to the explosion, the sickening lurch of the ship, the acrid smell of burning metal and cordite. He remembered the frantic scramble for damage control, the shouts, The screams. He'd been near the engine room when it happened, the vibration of the ship's massive engines, a constant thrum beneath his feet. Ashton had been on the bridge. The note was found near the main conduit, sir, Jack recalled. Where the electrical systems converge. Someone with engineering knowledge, or at least access to that area. Precisely, Ashton confirmed. And the detonator itself. Not field issue. Modified. Someone with a bit of ingenuity and a lot of malice. He paused, his brow furrowed in thought. We need to retrace the steps of everyone who was in the vicinity of the main conduit in the hours leading up to the explosion. It's a long shot, I know. But it's a shot we have to take, Jack finished, a grim determination settling over him. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was being overshadowed by a rising tide of resolve. The serpent had struck, but it hadn't won. Not yet. They moved, a silent understanding passing between them. Ashton headed towards the bridge, his authority undeniable, to begin coordinating with Captain Sterling and the ship's intelligence officers, a delicate dance of revealing just enough to gain cooperation without revealing the full extent of their suspicions, suspicions that could shatter the fragile morale of the entire operation. Jack, meanwhile, descended into the bowels of the Wakefield, the familiar scent of diesel fumes, sweat, and a faint metallic tang that now tasted like fear, filling his nostrils. His task was less glamorous, but no less vital. He needed to talk to the men, not in an official capacity, not as a sergeant interrogating his troops, but as a fellow soldier, a comrade. He needed to gauge their reactions, their fears, their stories. He needed to listen for the whispers that weren't about gremlins. He found himself in the mess hall, the once boisterous space now subdued, the air thick with unspoken anxiety. Soldiers sat in small groups, their faces etched with fatigue and a dawning apprehension. The explosion had been a rude awakening, a brutal punctuation mark to their journey. Private Miller sat alone, his gaze fixed on a half-eaten plate of beans, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Jack approached him, pulling up a chair. "Rough night, Miller." Miller jumped, his eyes wide. "Sarge? Yeah, real rough. Never heard anything like it." He shivered, despite the relative warmth of the mess hall. "Felt like the whole ship was going to blow apart." "It was close," Jack admitted, keeping his voice steady. "You still think it was gremlins?" Miller's face flushed. "Well, people say things, Sarge. Strange things happen at sea, especially when you're, going into a fight." He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "Heard one of the engineers say the wiring was messed up, like someone did it on purpose." Jack's gaze sharpened. "Who said that, Miller?" Just some of the guys, in the engine room. They were grumbling about it. Said it wasn't a simple fault. Said it looked deliberate." Miller's voice trembled. "But I don't know, Sarge. It's too much to think about. Germans, French. Now this." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's a lot." Jack agreed, his mind already filing away the information. The engineers. That narrowed the field considerably. "But we've got to think about it. We've got to figure out what's going on, for all our sakes." He spent the next hour moving through the ship, his conversations with various crew members forming a mosaic of fear and suspicion. He spoke to a grizzled deckhand who swore he saw a figure lurking near the aft section of the ship shortly before the blast, a figure too tall for a sailor, too furtive for a guard. He spoke to a young medic, still shaken from tending to the wounded, who mentioned a peculiar calmness in one of the engineers he assisted, a detached curiosity rather than panic. He spoke to a cook who'd overheard a hushed argument between two men in the galley the night before, something about orders and collateral damage. Each conversation was a tiny thread, seemingly insignificant on its own, but woven together, they began to form a pattern, a tapestry of unease. The serpent was weaving its way through them, its presence felt, but not yet seen. Ashton found him later, leaning against a bulkhead near the embarkation point, the air thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and anticipation. The first wave of landing craft were being lowered into the choppy water, their engines sputtering to life. The operation was proceeding, a testament to Sterling's unwavering resolve. But the atmosphere was far from the confident invasion they had trained for. It was a desperate scramble, a race against time and an unseen enemy. "Sterling's pushing the landing," Ashton said, his voice tight. "He believes we can still salvage the surprise. But he's wrong, Riley. The word will be out. The Vichy forces will be ready." "I spoke to some of the engineers, sir," Jack reported, relaying what he'd learned. "They're talking about deliberate sabotage, and there was an